Hey American literature friends, this is a video covering William Faulkner and his story A Rose for Emily. If you have a book, you can look up Faulkner and they give you a pretty good description of his life and his writing career. You see Faulkner right here in this famous picture of him. He was born in 1897, died in 1962. He is one of the two or three most famous modernists, most famous American writers of the 1900 to 1950 period. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949. So he is super important. When people think of American writers internationally, he is one of the main ones that they think of the past 120, 150 years. He's important. He is most famous for his novels and for his innovative use of like stream of consciousness, and for his writing about the American South and the sort of particular characteristics of the American South. As they tell you in the book, from 1929 and 1936, he published novels about childhood, family, sex, race, obsessions, time, the past, his native South, and the modern world. He invented voices for characters ranging from sages to children, criminals, the insane, and even the dead, sometimes all within one book. That's one of the things he's very famous for, is all of these different and distinct voices of his characters that he inhabits in his novels. He developed, beyond this ventriloquism, his own unmistakable narrative voice, urgent, intense, highly rhetorical. He experimented with narrative chronology. You get that in a lot of his books. There's this jumping around in time. Sometimes it's hard to figure out even. This sort of innovative and cutting edge use of different times, different timelines, jumping around between different voices. He invented an entire southern county and wrote its history. Faulkner was originally from Northeast Mississippi, and he lived most of his life in Oxford, Mississippi, small college town in Northeast Mississippi. And many of his most famous books are set in his imaginary version of that town and that county where he lived, and that includes A Rose for Emily. It's called, in real life, it's called Lafayette County. In Faulkner's imaginary world, where many of his novels and stories are set, like I said, including A Rose for Emily, is called Yoknapatawpha County, this sort of Native American name. And you can see this famous map that he drew in the 1940s of this county, and you can see the county, the town right here in the middle, which is called Jefferson, and which is the setting for A Rose for Emily, where Miss Emily and the rest of the town that tells the story lives. You can see it right there in the center, and then you can see the Yoknapatawpha River on the southern edge of the county. That's the bottom of the county, and you can see on this map that he drew where many of his most famous novels are located. Like go down Moses, which is a famous novel of his. His most famous novels are Absalom, Absalom, you can see it on the map, Light in August, The Sound and the Fury, The Hamlet, which is a famous later novel of his from the 1940s and the 1950s. So you can see where all of these, in fact, you can even see A Rose for Emily and Miss Emily's house right here on the sort of northwest corner of the town of Jefferson on the map. He drew this map in 1945. Faulkner moved to Canada and joined the Canadian Air Force during World War I to try to join World War I, because Canada was involved in World War I before the United States was. He never saw combat, but then he came back to Mississippi in 1920. He spent the 1920s sort of lost, trying to figure out what to do. He lived for a year in New Orleans in the mid-1920s, and he wrote his first novel there. It was published in 1926. And then in the late 1920s, he very clearly found himself. He seemed to find what he wanted in life, and he found his voice as a writer. He went to Europe in 1926, and then when he came back, in 1929, he married this woman who he had sort of dreamed about and always wanted to marry. She had married someone else, but then got divorced, and so once she got divorced, he married her They moved into this house that the two of them restored, this old house that the two of them restored together. That was in 1929. And then it was really in 1929 that, like I said, he really found his voice. His third novel came out in 1929. It's called Satirus. And then the novels that he became famous for began to come out in 1929. The Sound and the Fury came out in 1929. As I Lay Dying, which he wrote in 6 weeks while he was working third shift at a coal plant. It came out in 1930. Let's see if we can find Absalom. Yeah, Absalom was published in 1936. That is considered by most people his masterpiece. He also worked as a scriptwriter in Hollywood in the 1930s and 1940s, and even into the 1950s. He wrote the scripts for some relatively famous movies from the 1930s and 1940s. They even have a picture of one of the movies he wrote the script for in the book, if you've got the book, and they've got his map in the book on page 668 if you've got a book handy. What most people consider his genius period is really this period of about 15 years, from like 1929 until about until somewhere in World War II, the mid-1940s. As they tell you in the book, after World War II, his work became more traditional, less difficult to read. He wrote this trilogy about this family in Yoknapatawpha County, this poor white family who comes from the outskirts and then moves into the town of Jefferson. It's called the Snopes Trilogy. Like I said, he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1949, and that's when his reputation really became cemented as this sort of American genius. And then he died in the early 1960s in 1962. Faulkner is a member of, and probably the most famous member of, this literary movement called the Southern Renaissance, which sort of pushed back against the romanticization of the Old South, the romanticization of slavery, this sort of myth of the lost cause, and all this sort of celebration of the Old South and the antebellum South. Faulkner was part of this generation of Southern writers who appeared in the 19-teens and really the 1920s and 1930s, who pushed back against that and wrote about the South as this complicated place, the only part of the country that at that time had lost the war, this part of the country that really valued community over your personal beliefs and personal desires, the most conservative part of the country traditionally. You see when you think about the Southern Renaissance. There's a bunch of Southern Renaissance writers, but William Faulkner always comes first. And you can see, I bring that up because you can see let me flip ahead to his entire novel, As I Lay Dying, is in the book if you've got the book. But we're just going to stick to his short story, A Rose for Emily, because you get a little spoonful of Faulkner and his style and his main concerns if you read some of his short stories, especially A Rose for Emily. His most famous short story is a story called The Bear, about this group of people who hunt and kill wild bear in the Mississippi Delta in the 1920s and 1930s. A Rose for Emily, like I said, is one of the Yoknapatawpha stories. You can see where Emily Gerson's house is right there. The story is broken into 5 segments. There's a couple of things that are worth mentioning before we even get into the plot, the action of the story. The first is that this story is a first-person plural story. The voice that is telling the story seems to be the town, or not just a person in the town, but the people of the town watching Miss Emily as she grows up and grows older and sort of loses her mind and commits this crime. But the voice telling the story seems to be this collective voice of the town that watches her and judges her, that is sort of disgusted by her, but also sort of fascinated by her and like can't stop watching her, can't stop observing her. Emily comes from this family of this sort of Old South aristocracy, and part of what you're getting in this story is this sort of larger metaphor for the crumbling of the Old South aristocracy and the old families, from the 1850s and 1860s, and how they sort of fall apart and are trying to hold on to the old traditions and the old ways and this sort of old celebration of their name. But refusing to change is sort of poisonous and dangerous, as you see in this story. The sickness at the heart of Emily, the thing that really, I don't want to say kills her, but poisons her life, is her sort of refusal to adapt and refusal to change, and this sort of being stuck in the past and refusing to acknowledge that things are evolving and developing and changing. And you see that over and over again in this story when she refuses to pay her property taxes, which is one of the sort of signs of the times changing and civilization coming and advancing. You know, one of the things that happens in the story is they pave the sidewalks in the streets. Again, this sort of advance of technology in the early 20th century in the South. She refuses to let them put post office numbers on her house. You know, in the old days, when people got their mail, they would all have to go to the town post office. Well, as the post office advanced and expanded and sort of civilization got better, they began to put numbers on everybody's houses so that you could have mail delivery. Well, she refuses to let them put a number on her house. There is all of this refusing to change, holding on to the old days, holding on to the old ways, that she very clearly represents, because the old days were the best days for her and her family. The story is, so there's those 2 points, that sort of her symbolically representing tradition and refusing to change and hanging on to tradition, but also the voice telling the story, that collective, that first person collective voice telling the story. Those are 2 things to think about as you read the story. The story is broken into these 5 parts, and one of the things that is sort of tricky about that is the story starts with her dying. You get the first paragraph. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to the funeral. The men through a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, the women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house, which no one save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen at least 10 years. There's a bunch in that first paragraph that is important, and that a lot of the story revolves around things you find out in that first paragraph. Most of the story chronologically is just trying to work its way back to her funeral. Like, most of the story is just telling you all these things that happened when she was alive, and working its way in time back to the funeral so that you can find out what happened after her funeral. The manservant is this African-American servant of her family. In a lot of Faulkner stories and novels, there are these African-American characters who are sort of loyal to the white family that they have always worked for, and has always sort of taken care of them financially. But the truth is that really they have been taking care of the white families as they sort of fall apart or go through these dramas. That is especially true in this story too. You see this servant who has worked for her family. He works for her. She's the last Grierson, and then when he dies, he opens the door, lets the town in, and then walks off, and is like, I've been loyal to her, I've kept the family secrets, and now that she's dead, I'm done, I'm free of it, and I'm out of here. Very often in these Faulkner novels, you have these African-American characters who clearly have the most common sense, or the most grounded in reality, the least susceptible to these myths of the Old South and this sort of foolish hanging on to tradition and things like that. And you get a tiny little taste of that in this story. The best example of that is if you read Faulkner's novel, The Sound and the Fury. There is one whole section of that novel is told by the family maid, who is very clearly the sanest, most reasonable, commonsensical person, and who is the person who is holding the whole family together. This woman named Dilsey. Let's see if we get. You find out too that nobody had seen the inside of her house. She hadn't been letting anybody into her house at all. That becomes the big secret that is revealed at the end of the story, why that is, and especially the second floor of her house, which she has had the servant close off. So all of that stuff in the first paragraph is this sort of foreshadowing of what's coming, especially the curiosity to see the inside of her house, which is that dark secret that's revealed at the end of the story. You find out that her house was on this street, which had once been like the wealthiest place where everybody wanted to live, the most desirable part of this street, the most desirable part of town, but now it has sort of fallen into disrepair, and it's not even really a residential area anymore. There's like gas stations and stuff popping up around, and places like that popping up around her house. Her house is really this sort of old house as the town changes, and it's just sort of out of place because the town has changed. The first section also has that the tax notice stuff, where they try to get her to pay her property taxes, and she says this mayor, who is not the mayor anymore, and in fact has not been the mayor for so long that he's now dead, told her that she would never have to pay her property taxes for as long as she and her family lived at this house in town. They remitted her taxes, which means that she would never have to pay them. Well, the next generation has come along and been like, no, that we're not doing that anymore. And she just openly defies them, refuses to change, refuses to evolve. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, the arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. And so people are like, well, the old mayor is dead. He's not even mayor anymore, and he's dead. And like, times have changed, and you need to pay her taxes. And she just refuses and refuses and refuses. You also get this description of her physical body. They come to visit her to try to get her to pay her taxes. A small, fat woman in black. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water and of that pallid hue. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like two small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough. And you get this description of her as this elderly woman, but it is very clearly this description of a body decaying. And Faulkner is trying to suggest almost that she is just like rotting and decaying. And it's very clearly this physical representation, both of the sort of old South aristocracy and that clinging to tradition and how it is rotting away, literally. But also it is this representation of how she has sort of poisoned herself by this crime that you find out she's committed. And so she is just sick and decaying. You get that in the first section, the image of her physical decay, and the first section ends with her refusing to pay the taxes and being like, Colonel Sartoris, who is the old mayor, I have no taxes in Jefferson, the name of the town where she lives. The second section then jumps back 30 years. So she vanquished them horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. And the smell becomes important in this story because 30 years earlier, her house had smelled really bad. And people in the neighborhood had started to complain about the smell coming from her house. And the mystery of the smell and what caused it and what they did about it, that becomes the secret that you discover at the end of the story. You have this sequence of events that covers about 2 years that they tell you about in section 2, where the first thing that happens in that 2 years is her father dies, and her father had been overbearing and overprotective and had never allowed her to date, had been sort of doting on her, but also overly protective and never allowed her to really have a life. And you get the first hints of her mental illness because her dad dies and she refuses to admit it, and it takes 3 days. When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolences. Miss Emily met them at the door, and with no trace of grief on her face, she told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days. Just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away. And we knew that with nothing left, because she and her dad were the last surviving members of her family, they would have to cling to that which had robbed her, as people will. And so she didn't want to let her dad go, because even though he had been overbearing and overprotective, she was the only family he had left. He was the only family she had left, and now he was gone. It's the first hint of that mental illness, but also her unwillingness to change and willingness to let go of things. She finally breaks down and let them bury the dad. So that's the end of the second section. Let's see if we can pull this up. I forgot to pull this up. So here we go. There it is at the end of the second section. We did not say she was crazy. The third section then jumps you. She was sick. She was sick for a long time, and when we saw her again, her hair was cut. So after the death of her dad in this sort of episode where she refuses to believe that he's dead for a while or accept that he's dead, she cuts her hair really short. She comes back out, and then you get the next episode in this rough 2-year period. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks. Again, another example of progress coming and sort of technical advancements. One of the ways you know you're in a big city is there's these big wide paved roads, like 8 and 10 lane interstates versus like 2-lane roads in small towns. This sort of paving is one of the signs of progress. And the person who comes to pave the sidewalks is this guy named Homer Barron, who she then begins a relationship with. The construction company came, and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big dark ready man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him. Pretty soon he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons driving in the yellow wheel buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. So this guy comes to town to pave the sidewalks. He is this sort of representation of progress and change, which just makes it sort of strange that he and Emily come together, because she is this representation of the Old South. So it's sort of scandalous at first, because everybody in town is like, here's this outsider, this Yankee, and you're talking about the South in the 19-teens and 1920s. And it's sort of this small scandal that here she is, this Old South aristocratic family dating this regular worker from the North, this Yankee, this outsider. As soon as the old people said, "Poor Emily," the whispering began. Do you suppose it's really so? And so she and Homer see each other for a while. And then the other thing that is really memorable about Section 3 is that Homer comes into the picture. She clearly doesn't want to give him up. You get the sense that for her, it's her last chance. Now that her dad is gone, she has a chance to have a real adult relationship, like a romantic relationship with somebody. She doesn't want to let that chance go. And then there is this memorable last scene at the end of this, where she goes to the drugstore and buys a package of arsenic. If you don't know arsenic, it's people back then, it was fairly common because it was what they used for rat poison. Like if you had mice or rats or some kind of creatures in your house, you'd go buy arsenic, because it is a strong, deadly poison. So she goes to the drugstore. You have this memorable scene that is, again, foreshadowing. She won't tell the drugstore clerk what she wants the arsenic for. He writes on the package, you see the last thing, was written on the box under the skull and bones, "for rats." She won't admit what she wants it for, and the people in the town are afraid she's going to kill herself because Homer's broken up with her, broken her heart. But she doesn't kill herself, obviously, but it is this sort of foreshadowing of this dark secret that's coming, because she won't admit what she wants the poison for. The druggist finally gives it to her, but he writes on it, "for rats." And then Section 4 is really the big section. It's the longest, the richest section, because you find out, it becomes this sort of scandal. She's seeing Homer, they're riding around by themselves, courting. It becomes this sort of local scandal in this small southern town, because it's like they're setting a bad example for the kids, riding around unsupervised. And as you find out, then we said she will persuade him yet, because Homer himself had remarked he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. This is one of those things that in the early 20th century, the suggestion here is very clear that Homer is gay. But they could not talk about that openly in the early 20th century. And so often the way that got talked about is men like this would be talked about. They would be called confirmed bachelors or lifelong bachelors, or a sort of man's man. And so Faulkner gives you as much of a suggestion as he could have given you in the literature of the 19-teens and 1920s that Homer is gay. He likes Emily. They're riding around together. He likes spending time with her. But the suggestion here is that he is gay and he would never marry any woman, including Emily. So they've come to this sort of standoff of what are they going to do? What's Emily going to do about it? Then some of the ladies began to say that it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister to call upon her. And so they get the church involved. And then Emily goes to the store and buys a bunch of stuff clearly for Homer that people assume means that she has convinced him. She's convinced him to get married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver. A toilet set would be like a hairbrush, nail clippers, things like that, with the letters HB on each piece. 2 days later, we learned she had bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said they are married. So everybody in town is like, well, Emily won out. She convinced Homer to marry her. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming, or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. So she's had a couple of cousins staying with her. The suggestion here is either that he's going to come get her and take her back to wherever they're going to live in the north, like Chicago, and that she needs to get rid of her family, her distant cousins, send them back to Alabama where they came from to see about her and be sure she was okay. But the big surprise here is this next paragraph. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron, and of Miss Emily for some time. Now and then, we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the line. But for almost 6 months, she did not appear on the streets. And so Homer goes away and never comes back. And people are like, all the people in town are like, well, what happened? Like, he didn't come back. He didn't marry her. And so just like what happened after her dad died, she just basically locks herself in the house for about 6 months. Homer literally disappears. She disappears from the town because they see her in the house, but she locks herself up and doesn't go out in public for about 6 months. And so there is this mystery about where Homer went, but also what happened. Like, it seemed like they were about to get married. She bought all this stuff. Homer came to see her one night. Within 3 days, Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw the Negro man, the servant, and again, Faulkner using what would have been the sort of acceptable racial language of the time period, clearly an anachronistic racist term now, admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. So the last time anybody sees Homer, he comes into Emily's house right around sunset one night, and then they never see him again. Emily hides out for another 6 months, just like she did when her dad dies, and everybody's like, well, what happened? When we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat, and her hair was turning gray. During the next few years, it grew grayer and grayer. And remember the gray hair, it becomes a part of the dark secret that you get at the end of the story, until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray when it ceased turning. Up to the day of her death at 74, it was still that vigorous iron gray, like the hair of an active man. From that time on, her door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in china painting. So she gives little lessons to the girls in town about how to do that little miniature painting, like you would paint little designs on your dishes, like your teacups or your plates. She teaches this last generation of young women, girls and young women, like how to do that sort of intricate little china painting that you would decorate your dishes with. She does that for a few years, and then after that, she just basically becomes a recluse. She becomes like part of the town shut-in. She becomes this mystery where everybody in town is like, she's this crazy old lady locked in her house. And her family, she's from this famous family name, one of the most respected family names in town, this old wealth, but she and her house are just sitting there sort of slowly rotting and decaying away as this representation of the Old South and the Old South aristocracy. Meanwhile, her taxes had been remitted. Then the newer generation became the backbone and the spirit of the town, and the painting pupils grew up and fell away and did not send their children to her with the boxes of color. The front door closed upon the last one and remained closed for good. When the town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. So there's another, just like the refusing to pay taxes near the beginning of the story, here's this other sign near the end of the story of it. She's still the same person. She still refuses to change. The world is advancing and evolving and developing and becoming more civilized around her. And she's like, nope, I'm not changing. She's like this, she's stuck in time. She died, and so she died. Fell ill in the house, filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering man to wait on her. Still the same servant. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to get any information. He talked to no one, probably not even to her. She died in one of those downstairs rooms in a heavy walnut bed. And so she dies. And then you get the fifth section, the last section. Everybody in town, the old people in town, come to her funeral to pay respect. She's this old famous figure in town. She's been around, for 74 years. But the young people show up because they're like, the house is this mysterious, weird place where this older woman has been locked up and that they never see. And so half of them come to sort of commemorate and memorialize her, the older people. The younger people come because they're like, we can't wait to see inside this house. There is this sort of weird mystery to it. You get that in this. The two female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the second day. Already, and then the dark mystery begins to be revealed. Already we knew that there was one room in that region above the stairs which no one had seen in 40 years and would have to be forced. So they've got this one room on the second floor. The room that she looked down when she caught the guys spreading the lime around her house in the middle of the night when there was a bad smell coming from her house decades before, which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. So they get her buried, then they come back to the house, and we're like, all right, we got to go through this house and see what's in here. They break open the door to this upstairs bedroom, and what they find is, upon the balanced curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal and the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver, silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay a collar and a tie as if they had just been removed, which left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. So everything in the room is just covered in dust. It's been locked up for decades and decades. Upon a chair hung the suit, carefully folded. Beneath it, the two mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in bed. For a long while, we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. And so this is the mystery of what happened to Homer. She killed Homer with the arsenic. She poisoned him, and he died laying there in the bed in their bedroom that they were going to share. Since she couldn't have him, since he wouldn't settle down with her, since he wouldn't marry her, she was like, she figured out the only way she could keep him, the only way she could keep things from changing and have what she wanted was to have him as a corpse. And so she kills him, and that is the way that she can keep him. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, death, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay. And upon him and upon the pillow beside him lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. So they solved the mystery of where Homer went. Homer went into a room. And what smelled so bad, the smell that they were all worried about in the second section of the story 30 years ago, the smell was Homer rotting in that room before she locked it up and shut it up. That's what really stopped the smell, not those guys spreading lime around and all that stuff. And then there's an even darker, so she killed Homer, this dark secret at the heart of what happened to him. And then there's an even darker secret. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head, the pillow beside him where Emily had been sleeping with him on the bed even after he had died, the indentation where her head had been. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust, dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron-gray hair. And if you remember in the story, it is after Homer died that when she locks herself in her house for 6 months, when she reappears, she has that dark iron-gray hair. So what the story is trying to prove to you right there is she was sleeping with Homer's body after she killed him. His body was laying there, he had died, and she was still coming up there and sleeping with his body. And what finally stopped her from doing that is everybody in town complaining about the smell that was coming from the house, and her sort of final realization that she was going to have to give up sleeping with his body and close up the room. So that's what the smell was in the second section of the story. And when they come in the middle of the night and try to spread that lime around her house to kill the smell because they're afraid like an animal or something has died in her basement, she looks out the window and catches them. She's looking out from that window where she's up there sleeping with Homer's dead body. And that's when she realizes she's going to have to stop doing that because it's attracting too much attention. So you get this dark secret sort of at the center of Emily's life. She lost her dad. It sort of broke something in her. And so when Homer was going to leave her and not going to marry her, she came to the conclusion that the only way she could have him, the only way to keep him and keep things from changing and evolving, is to kill him. And that was the only way she could have him, and she had him that way until the smell got so bad that she had to shut the room up. So it becomes this sort of, you can clearly read it as this sort of story of this one eccentric, old, wealthy family that slowly disappears or dissolves in this town. You can also clearly read it, I think, as an indictment of like if you understand it in the way Faulkner understands the Old South, as this sort of indictment of people hanging on to tradition and the Old South and the myths of the Old South and the lost cause and like the antebellum South, that hanging on to those traditions is just this sort of poisoning yourself and rotting and decaying away, and that people need to adapt and change, like with paying the property taxes and the mail delivery coming and the sidewalks getting paved, and that refusing to change makes you just sort of stuck in time and decaying and is poisonous to you. Like Emily poisons Homer, but also poisons herself by refusing to adapt and change. So that is the Rose for Emily broken down into the 5 sections of it. If you've got questions about Faulkner, Faulkner's a really complicated writer. This story's not that complicated, but you get some of Faulkner's trademarks to like jumping around in time. You start from her death, then you jump back like 30 years and even beyond that, and then Faulkner slowly works you back to her funeral, which is right where the story starts. You get a lot of his trademarks, that sort of the weight of the community versus one person's desires or wants, which is especially powerful in these sort of conservative areas like the American South. You get the sort of power of tradition versus the sort of willingness or unwillingness to change, also traditionally important in the American South, the most traditional part of the United States. So you get a lot of Faulkner's themes, that sort of interesting narrative voice, in this case the first person plural, that jumping around in time, all of those kind of trademarks of Faulkner's big, complicated work. If you've got questions about Faulkner, about his winning the Nobel Prize, about his style, or where to start if you want to read more, be in touch with me and I'll be happy to dig into that with you. Otherwise, I hope this was helpful to you going through A Rose for Emily. Thanks.